This long-lost portrait appeared again a century later and altered history. The steady beat of autumn rain tapped against the windows of Morrison's auction house in Boston as Dr. James Parker flipped through boxes of forgotten photographs. The stale scent of aged paper and worn leather filled the tight back room where estate items waited to be sorted. James, a history professor who focused on post-Civil War America, had spent many Saturday mornings in places like this, hunting for pieces of history that never made it into textbooks. He lifted a stack of tintypes and cabinet cards, most showing serious Victorian families whose names had faded from memory. Then his hand stopped on one photograph. The image showed 6 African-American people posed formally in a studio, the kind of portrait that would have cost a working family several weeks of pay in 1890. James brought the photo closer to the weak light. The family was dressed with great care. The father sat in the center, his dark suit neatly pressed, a watch chain stretching across his vest. Next to him, a woman in a refined high-collared dress looked straight at the camera with calm pride. Their children, 3 young men and 1 woman, stood behind them. The painted background showed classical columns and a peaceful landscape, common in studios of that time. What caught James's attention first was how rare the image was. Photographs of African-American families from that era were uncommon and often lost or destroyed over time. This one had survived in striking condition. The sepia colors were still deep and the details sharp. He turned it over and saw faded writing on the back, "The Lawrence Family, Philadelphia, September 1890. He was about to put it aside when something made him look again. Their hands. Each person's hands were placed in an unusual way, not relaxed or neatly folded as was typical in Victorian portraits. The father's right hand rested on his knee with 3 fingers extended and 2 bent. The mother's hands were crossed in her lap, but her left thumb stuck out at a strange angle. One son held his hand flat against his chest. Another kept his hands behind his back in a stiff, awkward way. James felt his heart beat faster. In 15 years of studying old photographs, he had learned to notice small details others ignored. These hand positions were too careful, too exact to be accidental. They had meaning. He carried the photograph to the front counter, where Mrs. Morrison added up his items. $5 for everything, she said, barely looking at what he chose. James paid at once and slipped the photograph into his leather satchel. Outside, the rain was falling harder, but he hardly noticed. His thoughts raced with possibilities, historical clues, and a question that would not leave him. What were the Lawrence family trying to say to the world? On Monday morning, James laid the photograph across his desk at Northeastern University. Weak November light came through his office window as he placed his magnifying lamp directly over the image. He had spent the whole weekend thinking about those hands, unable to let go of the feeling that he had found something important. Under the magnifying glass, every detail stood out more clearly. The father, who looked to be in his 52nds, carried himself with dignity despite the strange position of his hand. His 3 extended fingers pointed gently downward. The mother's crossed hands revealed something else when magnified. Her right index finger touched her left wrist at a very exact spot, almost like checking a pulse, yet clearly done on purpose for the photo. The oldest son, standing behind his father, pressed his right hand flat against his chest, fingers spread wide. The second son's hands, held behind his back, were partly visible at his sides, and James noticed his thumbs were linked in an odd way. The daughter's hands rested on her mother's shoulder, but her pinky fingers were extended while the others curled inward. The youngest son, on the far right, had one hand in his pocket and the other hanging at his side, palm facing forward. James reached for his collection of books on Victorian photography. He had examined thousands of portraits from that period, and standard poses were well recorded. Photographers then gave clear instructions. Hands folded in the lap, resting on a table, holding a book, or placed neatly on armrests were common. What they did not do was arrange uneven, seemingly random hand positions that were different for each person in a group portrait. James photographed the image with his digital camera and enlarged sections on his computer screen. At higher magnification, the hand positions looked even more planned. These were not accidents or movements caught by a slow shutter. Each person had held still for the long exposure needed in 1890, meaning the gestures were chosen and held on purpose. James leaned back in his chair as his mind worked through the timeline. The photograph was dated September 1890. The Civil War had ended in 1865, and the 13th Amendment ended slavery that same year. The Underground Railroad, the secret network that helped enslaved people escape, had stopped operating by the end of the war, 25 years before this photo was taken. So why would a family in 1890 be using what looked like coded hand signals? James spent the next 2 weeks deep in research. He began with the most complete source he could access, a rare collection of Underground Railroad records in the university's special archives. The materials included letters between abolitionists, coded messages, quilts with symbolic designs, and, most importantly, a small leather journal once owned by a conductor named William Still, often called the father of the Underground Railroad. Still had carefully recorded the stories of hundreds of people he helped reach freedom. In the back pages of the journal, James found something unexpected: rough sketches of hand signals. The drawings were simple, but the notes were clear: signal for safe house, warning of danger, request for food and shelter, indication of number of travelers. James's hands shook as he compared the sketches to the photograph. The father's 3 raised fingers matched a signal, meaning 3 people seeking passage. The mother's finger on her wrist matched a sign for family or blood relation. The son with his hand on his chest was signaling freed person or survivor. James checked these findings against other sources. A memoir by Harriet Tubman's niece mentioned silent communication used when spoken words could mean death. A letter from Levi Coffin, a Quaker abolitionist, referred to the language of hands that guided souls to freedom. These signals had been vital when enslaved people and their helpers needed to recognize each other without speaking, especially in areas where slave catchers operated. Still, James kept returning to the same question. Why would the Lawrence family choose to be photographed using these signals in 1890? The need for secrecy had ended years earlier. There were no more escapes to plan, no safe houses to mark, no slave catchers to avoid. James decided to track the Lawrence name. Philadelphia city directories from 1890 listed several Lawrence families, but finding the Rye T1 required more clues. He needed to know where they lived, their jobs, anything that could narrow it down. He returned to the photograph and studied every detail. The studio backdrop drew his attention. Most photographers used common painted scenes, but this one had special features. The columns had unusual designs, and in the far background, barely visible, was a painted structure that looked like a real building. James began researching photography studios active in Philadelphia in 1890, matching their addresses with known backdrops. The work was slow, but on the 3rd day he found a match. The studio belonged to Augustus Washington, Jr., a black photographer who opened his business on South Street in Philadelphia in 1888. James learned that Washington was no ordinary photographer. He was the son of Augustus Washington Sr., a well-known daguerreotypist who had photographed Frederick Douglass and taken part in abolitionist circles before moving to Liberia in 1853. The younger Washington returned to the United States in 1885 and opened his studio mainly to serve the black community, at a time when many photographers refused black clients or charged unfair prices. Washington's studio became a place of pride and connection. James found a short mention of the studio in a 1982 Philadelphia Historical Society newsletter. It listed the address as 412 South Street. The building was gone, replaced by modern structures, but the Historical Society had saved some of Washington's business records, including an appointment ledger. James drove 2 hours to Philadelphia on a cold December morning. The Historical Society was housed in a converted townhouse in Society Hill, its rooms packed with documents, maps, and artifacts. A librarian named Dorothy, a black woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, welcomed him warmly. "We don't get many researchers interested in Augustus Washington, Jr.," she said as she led him to a climate-controlled room. His father is better known, but the son did important work recording the black community in the 1890s. She set a leather-bound ledger on the table. James slowly turned the pages, scanning entries from September 1890. Most entries were simple names, dates, and fees. Then he found it. September 14th, 1890. Lawrence family, 6 persons. Special sitting, no charge. No charge stood out. Washington ran a business, yet he photographed this family for free. The note special sitting appeared only twice that year. Dorothy, James said, looking up, what would make a sitting special in 1890? And why would a photographer not charge? Dorothy adjusted her glasses and studied the entry. Special sittings were often for respected community members or for photos meant to serve a special purpose. As for no charge, that suggested a close connection or a favor. In that time, doing work for free meant it mattered deeply to both sides. James photographed the ledger page and asked if there were any other materials from Washington. Dorothy went to the back and returned with a wooden box. Inside were loose papers, letters, and several dozen glass plate negatives wrapped carefully in cloth. She explained that Washington's studio closed in 1903 after his sudden death, and his widow donated these items to the Historical Society in 1911. James slowly examined the letters, most of them ordinary business notes. Then he found one that made him catch his breath. It was dated August 30th, 1890, 2 weeks before the Lawrence family photograph, written in neat script on cream-colored paper. Dear Augustus, I write to ask for your help with a matter of great personal meaning. My family wishes to create a lasting record, a testimony that will remain when memories fade. We have spoken among ourselves and believe you are the only one we can trust with this task. The sitting must be private, and we ask that you guide us in the old way. We will come to you in September. Your friend in freedom, Thomas Lawrence. The old way. James read the phrase again and again. It had to mean the hand signals. Thomas Lawrence was asking Washington help them create a photograph that preserved the secret language of the Underground Railroad. But why? What made it so important in 1890 that a family would request a special sitting just for this purpose? James photographed the letter and then turned to the glass negatives. Most showed standard Victorian portraits, but one stopped him completely. It was another photo taken the same day as the Lawrence family portrait. The same 6 people appeared, but this time they were standing, and their hands were arranged in entirely different positions. This was a second pose, a companion image to the one James had bought. He held the glass plate up to the light. In this version, Thomas Lawrence pointed 2 fingers toward the ground. His wife's hands formed a triangle. The oldest son crossed his arms, gripping opposite elbows. The second son held one hand palm up at waist height. The daughter's hands were clasped as if in prayer. The youngest son's hands hung freely at his sides, empty and natural. These were completely different signals. The Lawrence family had not made just one coded photograph, but 2, and each one carried a separate message. Dorothy, I need to photograph this negative. Can you develop it for me? She smiled and said, we have a darkroom. Give me an hour. While he waited, James walked through the streets of Philadelphia, trying to picture the city as it had been in 1890. The black community there had been large, made up of freed people, their children, and others who had escaped slavery before the war. They had built churches, schools, businesses, and groups that helped one another. When James returned, Dorothy handed him a freshly printed photograph. Seeing it fully developed and enlarged, he noticed new details. Behind the family in this second image, partly visible in the studio background, was a shelf of books. He could just read a few titles on the spines. James returned to Boston with copies of both photographs and the letter. He pinned them to the wall of his office and studied them for hours each day. Students passing his open door often saw him standing still, staring at the images, deep in thought. He focused on identifying the hand signals in the second photograph. By cross-checking with Underground Railroad records, he learned that Thomas Lawrence's 2-finger point meant direction north. His wife's triangle shape symbolized safe harbor. The eldest son's crossed arms stood for protection offered here. The second son's raised palm meant supplies were available. The daughter's prayer-like hands signified a faith community or church. The youngest son's empty hands confused James at first, until he found a note in an abolitionist diary. Empty hands meant freedom achieved. Together, the signals formed a clear message. Travel north to a safe place where protection and supplies are provided by the faith community. Freedom achieved. This was not just a family-saving history. They were recording something very specific. A certain place or moment tied to the Underground Railroad. But which place? And why did it still matter in 1890? James studied the book titles visible in the second photograph. Using photo enhancement software, he could read two of them. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass and Uncle Tom's Cabin. Both were important abolitionist books, but it was the third title, partly hidden, that mattered most. With careful enhancement, he made out the words Lombard Street Safe. Lombard Street. James searched for any link between Lombard Street and the Underground Railroad, and what he found amazed him. Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded in 1794, stood at 419 South 6th Street in Philadelphia. Over time, the church had used several properties. One smaller building on Lombard Street had served as a known Underground Railroad station from 1850 to 1863. That building was sold in 1867 and later turned into private homes. James found city records showing that Thomas Lawrence bought the property at 247 Lombard Street in 1875 and lived there until his death in 1902. The same building that had once hidden people seeking freedom before the Civil War had become the Lawrence family home. But the story did not end there. James uncovered a short article in the Philadelphia Tribune, a black newspaper dated July 4, 1890. It reported that the property at 247 Lombard Street would be torn down the following year to make room for business development. The Lawrence family, whoa. LD have to move. Suddenly, everything fit together. The family had not created these photographs only to honor the past. They were making a lasting record of the exact safe house where they had reached freedom, preserving the hand signals that guided them there before both the building and living memory vanished forever. James wanted to know the Lawrence family's full story, but tracing the lives of formerly enslaved people was extremely difficult. Many had changed their names after gaining freedom, and official records were often missing or never created for people once treated as property. James began with census data. Most of the 1890 census had been destroyed in a fire, but he found the Lawrence family in the 1880 Philadelphia census. Thomas Lawrence, age 42, born in Maryland. His wife Elizabeth, age 40, born in Virginia. Their children, William, age 18, Daniel, age 16, Sarah, age 14, and Joseph, age 12, all born in Pennsylvania. These birthplaces mattered. Thomas and Elizabeth were born in slave states, but their children were born in Pennsylvania, a free state. This showed that Thomas and Elizabeth had escaped slavery and reached Philadelphia before 1862, when their oldest child was born. James searched Maryland and Virginia records for any mention of enslaved people named Thomas and Elizabeth who vanished in the late 1850s or early 1860s. It felt like chasing shadows, but he kept going. At last, in a Maryland plantation ledger stored at the Library of Congress, he found an entry dated March 1861. Slaves Thomas and Elizabeth absconded. Reward offered for return. The plantation belonged to a man named Richard Garrett in Talbot County, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore. James felt his heart race. The Eastern Shore had been one of the busiest areas for Underground Railroad activity, largely because it was close to free states, and because Harriet Tubman, who was born there, had worked in that region. Further records showed that Garrett had placed ads about the escape in Baltimore newspapers. Thomas was described as a strong field hand, about 23 years old, and Elizabeth as a house servant, about 21, with child. Elizabeth had been pregnant when they escaped. James did the math quickly. If Elizabeth had been pregnant in March 1861 and William was born in 1862, then they reached Philadelphia with only a few months to spare. They had made the dangerous journey while Elizabeth carried their first child, risking everything for the hope of freedom. But how did they know about the safe house on Lombard Street? Who guided them there? What path did they follow? These questions led James to his next finding. He discovered a set of letters at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, written between members of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, a group that helped escaped enslaved people. One letter dated May 1861 mentioned the arrival of a young couple from Maryland, brought north by our friend from Delaware. That friend from Delaware was almost certain. Inley Thomas Garrett, a Quaker abolitionist from Wilmington and one of the most active conductors on the Underground Railroad. He had helped thousands escape and worked closely with Harriet Tubman. James traveled to Wilmington, Delaware, where the Thomas Garrett papers were kept at the Delaware Historical Society. The collection held detailed records of people Garrett had helped, including descriptions, dates, and sometimes names, though many were listed only by initials to protect them. In a ledger from spring 1861, James found an entry that matched T&E from Talbot County. It read, "Woman with child arrived March 29th, departed for Philadelphia March 31st, traveled with JM to safe station on Lombard." James searched other documents for the initials JM and found they belonged to Jonathan Miller, a free black man who worked as a conductor on the Philadelphia route. Miller met freedom seekers in Wilmington and guided them the final miles to safe houses in Philadelphia. Slowly, James rebuilt the Lawrence family's escape. Thomas and Elizabeth had fled the Garrett plantation in late March 1861, likely moving by night through Maryland's network of safe houses. They reached Thomas Garrett in Wilmington, stayed briefly, and were then sent north with Jonathan Miller. Miller brought them to the Lombard Street safe house, where they arrived in early April 1861. The timing mattered. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, with the attack on Fort Sumter. Thomas and Elizabeth escaped days before the country fell into war. They spent the early weeks of the conflict hidden in the basement of the Lombard Street house, unable to travel farther north because of the confusion and increased watchfulness that followed the outbreak of war. James found proof in another Vigilance Committee letter dated April 20, 1861. It stated that several people remained at stations, unable to continue to Canada due to increased surveillance. They were safe but anxious. Thomas and Elizabeth likely stayed in that basement for weeks, maybe even months, as Elizabeth's pregnancy advanced. Eventually, the family running the safe house helped them take the last name Lawrence, found Thomas work, and supported them as they joined Philadelphia's free black community. Their son William was born in Philadelphia as a free child, the first Lawrence born into freedom. But James still wanted to know who had run that safe house, who had taken such risks to protect them. Property records showed that the Lombard Street house in 1861 belonged to Reverend Jacob Bennett and his wife Martha, members of Mother Bethel AME Church. The Bennetts had operated the safe house from 1850 until the end of the war and had sheltered an estimated 200 people. James found a photograph of Reverend Bennett from 1865, a serious-looking man in his 52nd. Then he uncovered a connection that sent a chill through him. James learned that Martha Bennett, the Reverend's wife, had been photographed with the Lawrence family. In 1890, the image was in the Historical Society's collection and labeled simply Community Gathering, Mother Bethel Church, 1890. Standing beside Thomas Lawrence was an elderly woman identified as Martha Bennett. Her husband had died in 1876, but she had continued living in the Lombard Street house until it was sold to Thomas Lawrence in 1875. Thomas Lawrence had not just bought the house that once hid him. He had bought it from the woman who had sheltered him in her basement 29 years earlier. Martha Bennett sold him the property and then stayed on as his guest, completing a long circle of trust and gratitude. James finally understood the deep meaning of the photographs. When the building was set to be demolished in 1891, Thomas Lawrence wanted to create something that would last longer than bricks and wood. He wanted to preserve not only the memory of the safe house but also the secret language that had saved his family's lives. The hand signals in the first photograph were those Thomas and Elizabeth had used during their escape. Signals that marked them as freedom seekers, showed their needs, and connected them with helpers along the way. The signals in the second photograph represented the safe house itself, recording its purpose and its role in the Underground Railroad. Still, James had more questions. Why had the family kept these photographs private? Why were they never shared publicly? And what had happened to later generations? He searched death records and learned that Thomas Lawrence died in 1902 and Elizabeth in 1905. Their children went separate ways. William moved to New York, Daniel to Chicago, Sarah married and stayed in Philadelphia, and Joseph went west to California. The family spread out over time, as families do. James traced living descendants through genealogy databases and church records from Mother Bethel, which had kept careful membership lists. He found Sarah's great-great-granddaughter, Patricia, who lived in Atlanta, Georgia. James wrote to her explaining his research and asking if she knew about the photographs. Patricia replied within a week and invited him to visit, saying she had something important to show him. In January, James flew to Atlanta and met Patricia at her home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. Patricia, a retired teacher in her 72nd, welcomed him warmly. "My grandmother told me stories about the Lombard Street house," she said as she led him to the dining room. "She said it was sacred ground, a place where people prayed for freedom and found it." Patricia opened a cedar chest and carefully lifted out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were the two original photographs, the negatives and something else. A third photograph James had never seen. It showed the Lawrence family again, but this time Martha Bennett and Augustus Washington Jr. stood with them. 8 people were gathered in the studio, and their hands told another story. This photograph had never been archived or displayed. The Lawrence family had kept it private for more than a century, passing it down with clear instructions. Patricia explained that her grandmother said it was never to be shown publicly while anyone in the photo or their children were still alive. That promise had been kept until now, more than 130 years later. James studied the hand positions in this final image. Each person formed a signal, but these were not Underground Railroad codes. They were simpler and more universal. Hands clasped in friendship, hands over hearts, hands extended in offering and acceptance. Patricia then handed James a letter, yellowed with age, written by Thomas Lawrence in 1901, 1 year before he died. The letter had been kept with the photographs in the cedar chest. James read it aloud. "To my descendants, who will read this long after I am gone. These photographs tell our family's journey from bondage to freedom, from fear to safety, from desperation to hope. The hand signals you see were the silent language that saved our lives when words could bring capture and death. We made these images not to praise ourselves but to honor those who helped us, and to ensure that the courage and sacrifice of the Underground Railroad would never be forgotten. The house on Lombard Street where we first knew freedom is being torn down, but its spirit lives in these photographs. Remember that freedom is never free. It is gained with courage, protected with watchfulness, and passed on through testimony. Let these images speak. Across generations of the cost paid and the debts owed, we were strangers taken in, and we became family. That is the greatest truth of all." James felt his throat tighten as he finished reading. Patricia was quietly crying. "My grandmother said those hand signals were a language of survival," she said. "But in the last photograph, they became a language of love and thanks." James looked again at the third photograph, now seeing it fully. The signals were simpler because the message was simple. We survived together. We honored each other. We became family. Patricia agreed to allow the photographs to be shown publicly for the first time. James worked with the National Museum of African American History and Culture to create an exhibit that told the full story of the Lawrence family, from their escape in 1861 to their effort to protect the memory of those who helped them. The exhibition opened in the spring, and thousands came to see the photographs and learn about the hidden language of the Underground Railroad. Descendants of other families who had passed through the Lombard Street safe house shared their own stories, adding new layers to the history. On opening day, James stood in the gallery watching visitors study the images, read the signals, and understand the courage and communication that had saved so many lives. A young girl, about 10 years old, stood in front of the first Lawrence family photograph. Without realizing it, her hands copied the signals. "What do they mean?" she asked her mother. "They mean freedom," her mother replied. "And they mean that some things are too important to forget." James thought about the path that had led him there. From a rainy morning in a Boston auction house to this moment of truth and recognition, the Lawrence family had achieved their goal. They had preserved not only the memory of the Underground Railroad, but its language, hidden in plain sight in a photograph that waited more than a century to speak. The image that once seemed ordinary had indeed changed history, not by revealing something entirely new, but by saving something precious that was slowly disappearing. A record of survival, a language of freedom, and the lasting power of those who risk everything to help others reach liberty. Outside the museum, a soft spring rain began to fall, gentle and clean, like the rain that fell on the morning James first held the photograph and wondered what secrets it held. Now the secrets were known, the silence broken, and the Lawrence family's message had crossed a century to reach the world they hoped their descendants would inherit. A world that remembered, a world that honored,